The Vietnam War in the West, or Second Indochina War, was the most shameful U.S. defeat in history. The roots of this conflict date back to the Second World War. After the defeat of Japan, the Viet Minh organization began a guerrilla war for independence in the North, led by future Communist President Ho Chi Minh. The North subdued the cities of Hanoi, Thanh Hoa, and Vinh. In turn, the South was headed by Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, taking territories from Saigon to Da Nang. The new anti-communist leader in South Vietnam was supported by President Eisenhower. The first military conflict ended with the signing of the Geneva Accords, the division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel into a north and south, similar to Korea. But this did not suit the Vietnamese, who considered themselves a united nation. France's attempts to regain its former colony were unsuccessful. The rapid rise of communism in Eurasia worried the U.S. During the Second Indochina War, the U.S., led by President Eisenhower, joined the conflict. In the early years of this war, U.S. intervention was insignificant. Everything was limited to the appointment of 900 military advisors and instructors. New U.S. President John Kennedy had to expand the U.S. presence. Already in the 1960s, the first two helicopter companies arrived in Vietnam to support South Vietnamese soldiers. In addition, the military corps has gradually expanded. The 1961 Vienna negotiations between Kennedy and USSR leader Khrushchev on Vietnam had no positive results. The situation in the conflict was aggravated by the ineffectiveness of the South Vietnamese Army before the Vietnamese Army of the North, which, besides high morale, received support from the USSR. This prompts United States Army Commander General William Westmoreland to suggest a transition to an active actions of the U.S. Army and to develop his plan to defeat North Vietnam and the established Viet Minh military organization. The reason became a military coup, with the exception of South Vietnamese pro-American leader Ngo Dinh Diem and the assassination of President Kennedy a few weeks later. After Kennedy's death, President Johnson declared active war against communism. Meanwhile, anarchy and war for the power continue in South Vietnam. A year later, the U.S. presence in Vietnam ceases gradually but greatly. From this begins an active escalation of the conflict. North Vietnam, supported by China and the Soviet Union, faced open confrontation against South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies. However, the Pentagon and its then leader Robert McNamara completely underestimated the enemy. In the U.S. Army, the average age fell significantly from 26 during World War II to 22. Instead of a regular army in a battle against another regular army, U.S. troops faced a whole country of partisans. The 115,000-strong North Vietnamese army broke into groups across the country. North Vietnam chose an ambush strategy instead of a direct confrontation. The jungle with poisonous snakes was supplemented by ingenious Vietnamese traps. U.S. soldiers were massively caught in nail traps, exploded on grenades, and were bitten by snakes. The ingenious Vietnamese of the Viet Cong had built entire underground cities that could be up to 200 kilometers long. They allowed to perform unexpected sabotages against the South and then disappear like smoke. Underground were entire headquarters with kitchens, warehouses, hospitals, recreation rooms, and radio communications. Vietnamese underground supplied themselves with water from wells and electricity through bicycle generators. Underground cities have become stubborn strongholds and one of the reasons for the defeat of the United States. It was unbelievable, but those constructions dug by hand tools withstood even the impact of bombs. The largest tunnel in Cu Chi is still partially preserved and is an important tourist destination. In addition to the tunnels, North Vietnam received substantial support from its allies, instructors, coordinators, and new weapons from the USSR. The artery for the Soviet Lend-Lease became the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, consisting of a set of roads. It was due to it that the Vietnamese partisans, in addition to AKM assault rifles, got a lot of other weapons, like fighters MiG-17 and MiG-29, bombers Tu-28, T-54 tanks, missile system Divina, and S-75. The study of the USSR did not go without a trace. After a few years, the soldiers of North Vietnam learned to independently operate air defense and fly planes. However, the tendency to be thin and short in height allowed to move in underground cities without problems, but did not allow for complex maneuvers as a result of the overload, so often the Soviet pilots were at the helm. In response, the United States used modern F-4 and F-8 Crusader aircrafts in the skies over Vietnam, but those fighters were not as useful in the jungle as in the Korean skies, so Americans started using different strategies. US planes dropped poisonous substances on the jungle and burned the area with a combustible substance, napalm. The Pentagon ordered to organize the detection of underground cities. Tunnel rat units were created for this purpose. The lowest soldiers with lanterns and pistols overcame the traps in the narrow underground tunnels, but could not significantly prevent the Vietnamese activities. The war also had significant influence on firearms. In the early 1960s, the US government ordered Colt rifles of a new type, the M16, to test them in the real field in Vietnam. This was another factor in the coming defeat. Although the M16 was significantly dominated by AKM in its main characteristics, it was significantly less reliable. The rifles massively failed and were quite demanding when speaking of the quality of the cartridges, and in wartime, the US decided to save money on components for cartridges. Cheaper cartridges produced residue, the specific climate caused rapid clogging, and soldiers were not trained in care and using cleaning kits. This led to frequent jams of the shell casings and rifle failures, resulting in heavy casualties in the American Army. During the Vietnam War, United States-controlled Japan and the United States itself had revolts against the war. Society was sharply divided into two camps: the older adults who lived in World War II, convinced that power is the most important thing in the country, and the younger, more progressive generation, which considered its state an aggressor and refused to kill for ideology. If the first strikes were organized by students, they were later joined by entire organizations and veterans of Vietnam, throwing their medals at the Pentagon. The degree of tension was also increased by the fact of killing of the Vietnamese civilian population. Some units resembled gangs of thugs rather than the army. One of the best-known cases was the My Lai massacre, in which about 500 civilians were killed by American soldiers in Vietnam as a result of a desire to avenge their fallen comrades. The case went public in the United States, but only 1 in 80 suspects received a prison sentence. In total, during the Second Indochina War, more than 503,000 people refused to go to Vietnam to fight. This figure exceeded 40 times the number of those who refused to go to Korea. Some of the unwilling fled to Canada. Neutral to the conflict countries in Europe fled to the villages. For those who were already in Vietnam but did not want to fight, there was even a road from Japan to Europe through the USSR. More than 3,000 people received actual prison sentences for evasion of service. The most prominent case was Muhammad Ali's refusal in the late 1960s. Cassius Clay's refusal made him a real hero in certain circles. The boxer lost his professional license for refusing to leave for Vietnam, but did not abandon his ideals. Supported by anti-war organizations, Cassius traveled to schools and universities, inspiring more and more people against the war. At that time, the situation in Vietnam itself had only worsened. The insufficient number of military personnel was compensated by mentally handicapped people and even prisoners. Thanks to this step, the US presence became recording. This was perceived extremely negatively by the regular army and command of Vietnam. The availability of drugs made a fifth of the fighting force addicted. Most were addicted to marijuana or cocaine. An interesting fact was that in the early 1970s, 1 hospital-admitted wounded American fighter was counterbalanced by 4 hospitalizations due to overdose. An unpleasant psychological blow was the decision of the Allied Australians and New Zealand to withdraw their troops. The US Army began to divide, and discipline was reduced. According to various estimates, from 200 to 1,700 commanders were executed by their own troops, patched up as an accident or hostile sabotage. The end of the Vietnam-United States War was effectively set by one of North Vietnam's most serious offensives the following year. As a result of Operation Nguyen Hue, the Easter Offensive, also known as the 1972 Spring-Summer Offensive, the North Vietnamese Army suffered significant losses, but was able to push the South Vietnamese Army in all directions, in the north, south, and center, capturing considerable territory. The strategy of the Soviet Union, which relied on quantity, was successful. The South Vietnamese Army suffered significantly fewer casualties, and the United States suffered the lowest casualties in the war. However, this factor was due to the already lower activity of American troops in general. The weakness of the American Army in its current state and repeated strikes have led to severe demoralization in the country itself. President Nixon had no choice but to decide on the withdrawal of troops. In January next year, a peace agreement was signed in Paris, and 2 months later, the U.S. withdrew the remainder of its military contingent. Without U.S. support, over the next 2 years, North Vietnam completely conquers South Vietnam and creates a single state. In April '75, the war finally ended with the raising of the flag in Saigon. This war became the most violent and bloody conflict in the second half of the 20th century. Exact losses are still the subject of controversy. Official U.S. casualties are over 58,000, making Vietnam the fourth worst war casualty in U.S. history. Total military casualties on both sides are about 2 million, mostly Vietnamese from North Vietnam. Civilian casualties on both sides ranged from 4 to 5 million, although historians suggest that the real numbers are twice as high. More than 100,000 were injured, and millions became refugees. The war had significant consequences. The UN in 1973 seriously condemned the U.S. bombing of Vietnam. During the escalation, the U.S. dropped on Vietnam about 8 million tons of bombs. This is 4 times more than was dropped during World War II on the Third Reich. As a result of the U.S. leaders' desire to stop the spread of communism, more than 2 million people from the U.S. and allied countries passed through Vietnam. The U.S. spent a whopping $352 billion on this war. Vietnam's agrarian economy had been completely destroyed, and chemicals had done great damage to the country's flora. However, since the 1990s, the country has established its exports to the world and also set up diplomatic relations with different countries, including the U.S.